Israel has launched a massive bombing campaign against the Gaza Strip in what is undoubtedly the most brutal offensive since the 2014 war. As Israel enters its second week of indiscriminate bombings, hundreds of Palestinians have been martyred and many more wounded, with figures climbing into the thousands of injured. The collective mainstream media and Western governments have attempted to portray the onslaught as a mere crisis and to provide cover for Israel's crimes. On this program, we seek to expose those crimes and report the real story that Israel doesn't want you to see. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. On May 10, 2021, Israel began an offensive against the Gaza Strip, bombing the Palestinian enclave by land and by air. For several weeks prior, tensions were growing rapidly in occupied Palestine as Israeli forces cracked down on Palestinian protesters. The protests first began at Damascus Gate in Jerusalem as a result of restrictions that Israel had imposed on Palestinians during the holy month of Ramadan, as well as Israel's plans to evict Palestinian families living in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Earlier that day, on May 10th, Israeli forces stormed the Aqsa Mosque, firing tear gas and rubber-coated bullets at Palestinians while they were inside praying, leaving over 90 people injured. Israel's desecration of Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, drew widespread condemnation and rebuke from Muslims and non-Muslims alike. As a result, the Palestinian resistance group, Hamas, which is also in power in the Gaza Strip, issued an ultimatum demanding that Israel immediately withdraw from Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel ignored this, and Hamas responded shortly thereafter with rocket fire. Israel then began an offensive against Gaza, launching several airstrikes which have continued every day since May 10th. Thousands of Israeli reservists were called up, and there was a genuine fear that a ground invasion was about to take place. Just like in previous wars against Gaza in 2009 and 2014, Israel has been purposely targeting public and health infrastructure in Palestine. This is a war crime under the Geneva Convention. As a result of Israel's bombings, the only salination plant in the Gaza Strip has been put out of action. The only clinic that is able to carry out COVID-19 tests has also been damaged. 6 out of 10 electricity lines have been cut. As if the electricity situation wasn't already bad enough to begin with, people living in Gaza can get barely 4 to 5 hours of power a day. According to the Palestinian Water Authority, water supplies in Gaza have now been reduced by 40% as a result of the Israeli bombardments. Gaza's water infrastructure has been hit so severely that human waste and sewage are now overflowing onto the streets. Israel has also bombed the main roads that lead to Al-Shifa Hospital, making it more difficult for the wounded to reach the biggest hospital in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Health Ministry reported that one of its clinics was put out of action. Doctors Without Borders also reported damage to their clinic, and there are photographs all over Gaza of roads completely decimated. Health workers and residents alike describe horrific scenes of seeing loved ones and neighbors buried alive under the rubble, of digging out the deceased from underneath twisted metal and slabs of concrete. The result of Israeli warplanes indiscriminately bombing Gaza. A nurse at Al-Shifa Hospital told Al Jazeera that she had, quote, never seen anything like this in her life. There were body parts collected on hospital beds and unbearable scenes. On May 15th, an Israeli airstrike hit the offices of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera in Gaza. There were no deaths or injuries. However, despite several pleas from the Associated Press for Israel not to bomb the building and to allow them to gather belongings, they were ignored. And the entire 12-story building was leveled by Israeli warplanes as the entire world watched it collapse into rubble. Israel is openly bombing the buildings of some of the largest news outlets on the planet, and the so-called liberal democracies of the West say nothing and shrug it off like nothing happened. Videos have been pouring out of Gaza, one after the other, showing entire residential buildings collapsing under Israeli bombs. Within the first week, the number of deaths on the Israeli side has amounted to 10 people. On the Palestinian side, hundreds have been killed and thousands more have been injured. The majority of them are civilians, not Hamas. In the first week alone, Israel killed over 212 Palestinians. 61 of them were children. That's almost 1/3 of the casualties. I repeat, almost 1/3 of the casualties are children. The Gaza Health Ministry reports that over 1,400 Palestinians have been wounded. The UN says that over 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced and over 2,000 have lost their homes. And just to give you another idea of the level of cruelty and barbarism enacted by the Israelis, in the same week, multiple Palestinian families were wiped out entirely by Israeli bombs. On Friday, May 14th, the entire Tanani family in northern Gaza was killed by an Israeli airstrike which completely flattened their home. The next day, on May 15th, 10 family members of the Al-Hadidi family were killed by an Israeli airstrike on the Shati refugee camp in Gaza. And this is always the case. Every single time Israel attacks Gaza, the death toll is incomparable. The number of casualties is always so much higher on the Palestinian side. The Israelis have an air force, they have a navy, they have drones, they receive billions in military aid every single year from the US. This is asymmetrical warfare at best, and it's a bloodbath at worst. Joining me is Dina Al-Mouti. She's a trauma-informed clinician and has written extensively for Electronic Intifada. Thanks for coming on. It's a privilege to have you, Dina.
The honor is mine. The honor is mine.
Right now in Gaza, almost 1/3 of the casualties are children. And we talk a lot about the killed and the wounded, which is horrific in of itself, but what kind of effect does this violence have on the children who survive? I mean, what does that leave them with?
I guess to me, calling it a war simplifies it. There are no two sides in equal defense of each other. It's a merciless genocide that's being committed against people who are unable to leave, unable to get shelter, unable to get medical attention. You know, it's wholesale slaughter, state-sanctioned genocide. And what effect does that have on an entire population, on generation after generation? It's human devastation on an unimaginable scale. I mean, Palestinian children close their eyes and see nothing but devastation. They open their eyes to the same, and they grow up fluent in a language of grief and trauma. Trauma is like a second language to them, essentially. It rearranges their lives. It interrupts it, if you will, over and over and over again, one onslaught after another. Their thoughts run on death, destruction, calamity. Under those conditions, the chronic traumatic stress becomes so, common that it's their normal. The trauma actually embeds itself in their cells. It alters their DNA, and that passes on one generation after another. It actually becomes generational. So talk about like developmental disruption. That's exactly what Israel is intent on, to disrupt lives, to disrupt the normal progression. It wants to constantly have one assault after another to disrupt a normal development from occurring.
So do we have any figures? Do we know what percentage of children are diagnosed? I mean, what about those who are never diagnosed, who may have some trauma or scars? I mean, do we have any idea of these consequences in terms of numbers?
I would tell people to turn to DCI, Defense for Children International. They have amazing figures to, they will document a lot of what's happening. But even then, I feel like that's scratching the surface of what's happening. I mean, even children in Gaza right now who are receiving psychosocial care, for what happened during the last onslaught are being killed as of, today and yesterday. And so how do you keep up? How do you keep track of who's suffering?
Regarding chemical, biological weapons, we've seen reports that Israel's potentially been using white phosphorus in the last days, and we know they did in 2009. I mean, what does that do to someone whose brain is still developing?
Oh, the effect that it would have on like entire generations are going to suffer immeasurable consequences to their immune system, endocrine system, their neurological system. This is all very calculated, mind you. None of it is by accident. It's all very, very calculated and by design. These endocrine disruptors will affect fertility. When I was there in 2014, I saw children born with ambiguous genitalia, with all kinds of cancers. This is affecting so much more than just, what you see on the surface. This is a very generational thing designed to destroy generation after generation after generation, all very calculated, and none of it by accident or just to create destruction on a large scale. It's designed to create destruction for generations to come, even in unborn children, if you will. So it's incomprehensible.
So, Dina, lastly, we've seen a massive general strike all across Palestine, perhaps the biggest in Palestinian history. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Does it make you feel hopeful at all?
I think this is a monumental time in history. We're going to look back, and when people ask, where were you when this or that happened? Were you standing on the right side? Were you standing on the side of the oppressed? Did you choose to make a conscious effort to speak up even when it wasn't as popular, or when, wasn't good for your career, or what have you? I do have hope. I will always have hope as a Palestinian. I think a lot more needs to be done. We need to see more than lip service. We need more than what's being done, because I feel like this world continues to fail Palestine in every conceivable way, but I do have hope.
Reacting to Israel's latest attacks on Gaza, the response from the majority of Western governments is just as you'd expect. Lackluster at best, and at worst, a complete whitewashing of Israeli crimes. Some European countries thought that it would be a wise idea to take a side, and of course they decided to pander to the Israeli lobby. Czech President Zeman ordered that an Israeli flag be raised over Prague Castle in a show of solidarity with the Israeli occupation, or as most would correctly put it, in a show of hostility to the Palestinians. The Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz also decided to fly the Israeli flag, which was raised over the Chancellery building in the capital, Vienna. Now, to say this was done in extremely poor taste is an understatement. Austria is a neutral country, at least officially, and Vienna has long boasted to be the world's capital of international diplomacy. It's home to one of the United Nations headquarters, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and many other international organizations. And this isn't just about violating supposed neutrality, but this move shows that the Austrian and Czech governments to be on the side of the Israeli occupation, on the side of the oppressors. The United Kingdom's Foreign Minister Dominic Raab condemned Hamas firing rockets at Israel, but of course said nothing of Israel's bombardment of Gaza, which has killed hundreds. This was followed up by a readout from the White House regarding U.S. President Joe Biden's call with Netanyahu, in which Biden reaffirmed Israel's, quote, right to defend itself, whatever that means. Joining me is Jennifer Löwenstein. She's a freelance journalist, human rights activist, professor of Middle East Studies, and also works with Eyewitness Palestine. Thank you for taking the time, Jennifer. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jennifer, I want to start out with the Biden administration's response to what's happening now in Gaza. What are your thoughts on what Jen Psaki, the White House spokesperson, said? Secretary of State Blinken. I mean, what did you think of their assessment and response to what Israel is doing right now in Palestine?
I think their responses have been absolutely criminal. And I don't honestly know if they are criminal intentionally or whether these two people are just incredibly ignorant. When you hear the President of the United States saying that the aggressor in a conflict has the right to self-defense, there's something very, very wrong with that response. The aggressor in any military situation is not the one defending itself. So I've been very disappointed both with his response and also with Secretary of State Antony Blinken's response, who said yesterday that there was no equivalence between the Hamas organization and Israel, and said that Israel had the right to self-defense. So once again, he's got it completely backwards.
Okay, so I mean, what do you say to people who would respond that basically, Palestinians, that Hamas, they're the ones who started everything, and that basically they're responsible for any civilian casualties? I mean, what do you respond to people who say that?
I would say that if they're looking at a situation in a very, very short-term setting, that they can possibly come away with that view. But even if they take into consideration the events of the last 2 weeks, Israel is the aggressor. Israel went into the Aqsa Mosque and beat up worshipers during the holiest holiday for Muslims. Israel is expelling citizens from the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Israel is the one who is backing up Jewish settlers who are running around in East Jerusalem and elsewhere saying death to Arabs, and we're burning Arabs today. Israel is the one that is causing displacement, dispossession, home demolitions, you name it. That is the aggressor. That's not somebody defending itself. The responses to these actions by Israel are resistance. Resistance is legal under international law in whatever form the resistors wish to take.
So, I mean, speaking of international law, at the United Nations Security Council, just in the past week, the United States 3 times blocked a statement which called for a ceasefire. Everyone else in the UN Security Council was in favor of it. But the United States blocked it because of language that would have condemned Israel's actions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I call the veto power in the United Nations Security Council, I call it the tyranny of the veto, because of course, pretty much world public opinion is on the side of the Palestinians right now. It's a very, very small percentage of people who actually support what Israel is doing. For the United States to block any language supporting a ceasefire is a form of tyranny. And it's also, once again, it's criminally sadistic in my view. We're talking about an action right now that has led to the deaths of 213 people in the Gaza Strip, 61 of them children, 35 approximately of women. More children have died in Gaza than Hamas fighters. There's something terribly wrong with that. It's all completely against international law because the Gaza Strip is illegally occupied by Israel. That's as plain and as clear as day for anyone who wishes to read international law.
So, I mean, what does that say when in the middle of all this, the Biden administration, they just approved a new weapons sale to Israel worth $735 million just on Monday, May 17th?
It's my understanding is that it was approved slightly earlier than that. That doesn't change the fact that they are approving more military aid to Israel on top of $3.8 billion of aid every year. And it is in direct contravention of what is called the Leahy Law in the US Congress, which says that it's illegal to give military aid to any country using it to violate the human rights and the civil rights of another people. And of course, this aid is not only violating people's rights, it's murdering them outright.
You know, I think it's extremely sobering what you just said, that more children have died than Hamas fighters. I mean, this is astonishing.
14 families have been wiped out in the Gaza Strip in the last week. 14 entire families. They'll no longer appear on the civil record. That is hard for anyone to imagine, but it's indescribable to imagine that many people, that many family units just disappearing under the rubble of a bombardment that is so completely illegal and so aggressive, such as it's a crime of evil. I can't think of another word for it.
And just lastly, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the motivations behind this, on the Likud party. I mean, do you think that perhaps this is something to do with what's happening internally in Israel with Netanyahu? Do you think there's some ulterior motive that's going on here and not just Hamas, like they claim?
I do. I think there are two parallel things happening right now. I think the greater goal of Israel is for a greater Israel. It is to have a nation that has no Palestinians in it. It is to isolate Palestinians in the West Bank into 165 disconnected enclaves. That is without doubt, it's a form of ethnic cleansing. Some people have actually started to call this a genocide. At the same time, Netanyahu will do absolutely anything to stay in power, to avoid going to prison. He's a corrupt politician. He's an unethical politician. And, you know, the words to describe somebody like him who is so utterly criminal and without any conscience whatsoever. I mean, he's psychopathic, and his actions, I think, display this. He doesn't care about the deaths of people in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank or for that matter, in Israel. He doesn't care. He cares about power. And that is something that we should all be very sober about when analyzing this situation.
As Israel continues to bomb Gaza, protests in support of Palestine have erupted all across the world. In London alone, an impressive 100,000 people took to the streets in a show of solidarity. Protesters marched onto the Israeli embassy in London, demanding an end to the Israeli violence, chanting, "Free Palestine," and "Israel is a terror state." A petition on the British government's own website calling on the UK to impose sanctions on Israel received over 300,000 signatures. This means the matter could potentially be raised and discussed in the House of Commons, as the British Parliament usually considers bringing up petitions for debate if they reach a minimum of 100,000 signatures. In France, several protests were held across many cities in support of Palestine. However, a large gathering that was planned in Paris was banned. People still showed up regardless to express their support, but were met with water cannons and tear gas from the French police. In Lebanon and Jordan, dozens of people went to their respective borders with occupied Palestine in an attempt to storm them and cross over. And in another remarkable show of solidarity, Italian dock workers at the port of Livorno refused to load weapons and explosives that were headed for the Israeli occupation, stating that they would not be an accomplice in the massacre of the Palestinian people. All around the world, people continued to show support for Palestine with large protests in several cities across Canada, Germany, and cities all across the world such as Warsaw, New York, Cape Town, Madrid, Sydney, and many more. Popular support for Palestine is real, it is widespread, it is international, and it is powerful. And although many governments do not reflect the will of their people, the average person does know right from wrong. And they're starting to see through the whitewashing of Israeli crimes and apartheid. It is undeniable. The public opinion is shifting, and it's shifting in the right direction. It's shifting in support for Palestine. On May 18th, 2021, a general strike was held to protest Israel's crimes in Palestine, and participation was at record levels, with millions of Palestinians taking part from the West Bank to Gaza to Jerusalem to Haifa, Ramallah, Bethlehem, and many more. Shops were closed, people took to the streets, and they marched in protest of Israel's ruthless bombings, of their plans to evict people in Sheikh Jarrah, and all of the occupation in its entirety. Once again, the death toll in Gaza speaks for itself. The bombed out hospitals, clinics, schools, shelters, roads speak for themselves. What Israel is doing is not just horrific, it is evil. No sane or rational person can look at this and call this defense. This is not defense. This is offense. This is aggression. This is a violent, calculated destruction of public infrastructure. It's a massacring of the Palestinian people. Almost 1/3 of the casualties are children. Are they also Hamas fighters? Israel has 10 casualties versus hundreds on the Palestinian side. You cannot inflict 10 times, 20 times more casualties on someone smaller and weaker than you and then pretend that you are the victim. And we constantly hear that Israel has the right to defend itself. Really? What about Palestinians? Palestinians don't have the right to defend themselves when they are being massacred. Palestinians don't have the right to defend themselves from Israeli bombs. Palestinians don't have the right to defend themselves from Israeli occupation. You want us to believe that Palestinians are a threat when they don't even have an air force, a navy, or any conventional armed forces? Israel kills 10 times more people. Israel drops bombs on hospitals, roads, schools. It kills journalists, medics. It levels the buildings of the international press. And you want us to believe that that's defensive and that Palestinians are the problem? You cannot talk about defense when you are in a position of power and you are the aggressor, when you are occupying and colonizing someone else's land. Israel is not a victim, nor is it acting out of self-defense. The Israelis are colonizers. It is the Palestinians who are defending themselves. The Palestinians are resisting Israeli occupation. They're defending themselves and their land from colonizers. This is why Israel tries so hard to smear those who expose its crimes, to character assassinate them and shift the conversation away from its ethnic cleansing of Palestine and its brutal military occupation and make it about personal smears. The Israeli lobby spends an awful lot of time and energy waging war against those critical of the Zionist regime. The mainstream media is more than happy to cover for them, and this is why we cannot allow what is happening in Gaza, what has been happening in Palestine for the last 73 years, to be whitewashed and erased by them. Despite the overwhelming support and backing of the West for Israel, people must never be afraid to document Israel's crimes and to expose the true nature of the Zionist regime. The support for Palestine is fundamentally rooted in the defense of human rights, in anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and their cause is a just and noble one. Palestinians need all the support they can get, and we will give it to them. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.